Welcome to the Shared Practices podcast. We are going to infinity and beyond here with this Ask
That's
George.
so good.
We were joking about the title. This is a part 2 in a super productive, amazing discussion. You know, we've been talking about startups and acquisitions, practice ownership for 8 years. And these 2 episodes are blowing my mind because we're combining our framework of practice ownership, our avatars, our growth pathways with which is the appropriate tool. And this is an exciting episode because now we're talking about beyond the first practice. So talk to us a little bit about this, George.
Yeah, so I'm actually with the upcoming CEO course in January. I'll be teaching just an hour about multi-practice. And so I kind of put together some first principles. And one of the most important things that I start with is passion or purpose. You've got to have one or the other to do this. It's got to be some level of an irrational drive pushing you. It has to be.
Yeah.
And you, Richard, you know from doing this, right? It's not easy.
No.
And you don't get there's a lot of rainy days. And the sunny days, there's sunny days and rainy days, right? When you're owning and operating a business. And the amount of rainy days that you have and the stress level of operating a larger group is fairly high. And if you're just doing it for a financial reason and you don't have a passion for entrepreneurship and the challenges or a deep purpose behind the company mission and why you're doing this, it can be hard to make it through those times and understand why am I putting myself through this type of misery? And so I think that before we get to the acquisition or startup, I just want to spend a little bit of time on if you're going to have beyond one location, spend the time to think about what you're doing and why and what's the end goal and have some of those things put together. And so I kind of wanted to put together a menu of different options.
Wait, well let me comment on 2 of those things first. I think for your first 3 to 5 practices, so going from 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 till you really have competent central people that you can start to lean on and rely on, you're literally multiplying your rainy days that you would have in one office or more. Now, so it's 2 offices, you have double the number of rainy days that you had owning one practice, triple, quadruple. And the problems get bigger because now there are other doctors rather than a hygienist freaking out. You've got a doctor freaking out. And turnover and all of these costs and all of the risk and all of the stress. So that's the first thing. The second thing is I'm so glad you're having this discussion because I was literally talking with a doctor, he'll know who he is, who bought his second and third practice just because how could he not? They were such good deals. And I'm like, what is your long-term goal? What is your vision? He's like, I don't know. He's like, I just thought I could and why not? So he did. And I'm like, no. You got to figure this out.
There's something very important called the burden of ownership, right? So at SP, we talk all about ownership and we get everyone all fired up and no. Ownership comes with 2 sides. There's the control, the autonomy, and then there's a burden. When you own something, you are responsible for the expenses, you're responsible for the people, you're responsible for the debt, you're responsible for the performance, you're responsible for a lot of things. You're burdened with all of those things.
Yeah.
And so, I think that where I really want to start is, with that idea of what am I doing and why? And, even before that, have I developed the core competencies already? Have I onboarded an associate? Have I had an associate work underneath me and have that become successful? Have I had the office perform when I'm not there? These are some things that level one office. You should get those things figured out because I find a lot of times what dentists do with their second location especially is they've had success in their first office because of their performance as a clinician. And then they go, okay, I'm doing well. And I remember I heard this piece of advice and I find it to be not very good because it said, if you're earning $500,000 per year as an owner, you're ready for your second.
Oh,
I was like, no, it's not. There's not a financial number that it's a practice operations and infrastructure assessment that lets you know you're ready for the other one. So I'll help people self-assess. Do you have an associate working in your first office? Do you have days in which you do not go there and the business continues to perform? Those are like some very basic requirements. And do you have a leadership team beyond yourself? Do you have an office manager, and do you have departmental
Team
leads?
leads, yeah.
Yeah, like those are important things. And if you haven't done that, then you are potentially running while you're still like you're going from crawling to running without walking in between. And you're going to fall and learn things because you didn't take the proper progression of growth. And so, I'll just say that to kind of get started. So that's like the assessment with one office.
And this is why you and I think are more on alignment now than we ever been, that going towards group first
Yes,
should be the first step. If you can't
totally.
get to 2 doctors in one office, and maybe you're in a demographic, you're so rural that you're in a town that literally could not support a second doctor. That is the one pass that someone gets to this piece of advice.
I don't even believe that one, but yeah, go ahead.
Yeah, exactly. But the profit from that first office, the ability to bring in a second doctor and then scale back, and then maybe bring in someone to replace you and have the office still generate profit and income is huge. And if you are tied to the chair because you are the main producer and you are driving all profit, you can't step away. And then all of these other problems and fires and rainy days at the other offices, the burden of ownership is much, much, much greater when everything in your first office is dependent on you.
So now let's kind of proceed along this conversation where we say, okay, my practice has an associate, check. We operate on processes, check. I have team leads who work in the practice and are leading the office when I'm not there, check. And I have, and this is where you and I differ, and I think we should spend a little bit of time on this. I have a love for I just like the game, the challenge, I just like this morning I was on a call related to like a legal matter that came from owning and operating multiple practices and having layers of management and all of that. And like, I loved it. It fired me up. And like, Richard's just shaking his head and he's like, that's horrible, know? And Richard, like, that stuff weighs you down. And for me, I get energy out of it. I love the problem solving. I love the challenges. It's fun. And so I have a passion and an irrational love for dental entrepreneurship. And that's my passion or purpose. Like, I do have a purpose behind what we do, but what really gets me up every day to like own and operate multiple practices is the love for dental entrepreneurship. And so, Richard, maybe the contrasting perspective would be good, because I know you don't have that same like love that I do for multi-practice.
Yeah, I think being a people pleaser should be a little bit of a red flag for anyone who's listening to this. If you want to own multiple practices and you're a people pleaser, like, I think that's a check mark in the other direction, because people are going to be mad at you. People are going to be frustrated
all the time.
You're not going to have the same close-knit like culture that you have in one office with a really efficient team. Culture is so hard to scale. And to like, it turns over. Maybe it's good at first at the second office and the third office, and then you lose a doctor, you lose a team lead, and then all of a sudden it all kind of spirals.
Yeah. So, okay. So that was great, Richard. I totally forgot that, for me, I'm much less people pleaser. I'll put it that way. And so I think that, now we've done the assessment, right? So our listeners, they know one way or the other, multi-practice is a green light, or multi-practice is maybe for me, but not right now. And I need to go back to the office and do some work. So now the next question that I have is how big, and you need to ask yourself why, right? You need to have a good reason why, but I'll kind of put some options on the menu. 2 to 3 offices, 4 to 8, 9 to 20. Those are my options. And the reason then I'm going to explain each one. 2 to 3, you're essentially operating your own group. You are the manager, you are the owner, and each office will run itself, and you don't have a central support apparatus. You don't have a regional manager usually. Like, you are the center.
Or you have one really good COO type person who just handles everything between the 3 and kind of acts like the real office manager
of all 3 locations. Yeah,
exactly. So one of those 2s, that's your only central employee, is that one key person.
And the reason why we use this word central employee is important to understand. So when you own and operate one practice, you have the costs associated with that office plus your note. And those are your layers of expenses. Once you start adding like we're talking about this COO, manager person, right now, let's say their salary is $100,000 per year. That means that each of the 3 offices, or if it's 2 offices, the first $50,000 of profit that you get after paying all the expenses and operating the location, paying your debt associated with owning that location, the first $50,000 you get from either location goes to pay that manager before any of it makes its way back to you. Right. So as you're kind of growing, you got to understand that like you don't want to have a ton of these like a third layer of central expenses until you have a lot of practices. So that's where I think 2 to 3 is like the roll up your sleeves, do it yourself group. 4 to 8 is where I put like the one regional manager is managing the office managers, and you kind of have that set up. And then 9 to 20 is like, okay, we've got an accountant in house, we've got like HR, maybe like, you start to complexify your, your operation. And so like, that's the first thing that I would really get an assessment of is how big am I going?
Yeah.
And like, am I 2 to 3? Am I 4 to 8? Am I 9 to 20? And the reason I stop at 20 is because I would say of the multi-practice owners, less than 20% of people who own more than one practice ever get beyond that. And so you're talking like, it's not that I'm saying you can't. I'm just saying you should plan on getting to 9 to 20 and then at that time reevaluate your goals. Yep. Rather than saying I want more than that from the onset. I think from the onset, those should be your goals. Do I want 2 to 3? Do I want 4 to 8? Or do I want 9 to 20?
I think another key differentiator here is 2 to 3, you can still practice dentistry some amount of time, whether it's 2-3 days, maybe 4 days, like maybe you get it up and run, like you scale back for a little period of time, get it up and running, and then you can take on more clinical days if you wanted to. But realistically, I think the 4 to 8 is when long-term you need to expect that you're not practicing dentistry.
And once you stop practicing dentistry, you stop receiving a clinical income. Right. And so that's something else that needs to be considered. So I would say, like 2 to 3, you're still a dentist. Your dentistry is the majority of your income. And then you're owning and operating this business to grow your net worth. And then 4 to 8, if you're the only exception that I would have to clinical dentistry in a 4 to 8 group is if you are somebody who's very passionate about clinical mentorship, then you would be like the clinical mentor who's doing cases and helping associates grow. So maybe you're going between offices, helping associates do more complex procedures, and you're growing your leadership, and your organization through leveraging your clinical abilities. But then, as you get bigger, you will, to survive and to do well, you will need to remove yourself more and more from the clinical components of being a dentist.
So the next layer in my mind, unless you've got something else, would be, what is your long-term plan? Are you planning on cash flowing and holding this as a cash flowing asset that you love managing? You love the purpose and what it does for you, and mentoring doctors, and the challenges. You're like, you know what? I can weather this. I can stomach this, and I'm planning on building it in a way as I grow, and then at its steady state where I can continue to own and operate this in perpetuity, and it just is a cash flow machine? Or are you building to sell an asset? And those are 2 very different plays.
Very different. And I wanted to kind of reiterate in this conversation that, when you're evaluating your why, your timeline, like Richard talked about, really important. And also, like, there's just a fundamental I want to introduce here: quality over quantity. Quality over quantity. And I'll tell a story. So I was sitting in the conference room of one of top 10 DSOs in the country, and there was an individual who joined the DSO by selling their 6 offices. And they had 6 practices, and they sold them to this DSO, and that's kind of how they got involved. And this individual told me, he said, when I sold my 6 offices, one of them was worth as much as the other 5. So like the big check that individual got, half of that check was from one office. The other half of that check was from 5 offices. And my point is that as we're talking about 2 to 3, 4 to 8, 9 to 20, like 15 sounds so good.
Mm-hmm.
But like quality over quantity, there's a chance that that 3 practice group would net the person selling it in proceeds after their debt more than a 15 practice group of smaller locations with more debt. So like quality is way more important. These locations cash flow, they grow, they're run well. Quality over I have X number of locations so I can tell people about it and it sounds so cool is like, that's kind of like you're falling for the trick that many fall for in multi-practice. And we, I would say, at times have fallen for that as well. And we've had to turn our quantity into quality with time. But like quality matters way more than quantity.
So here's my piece of advice that I've started giving people was not only build your first office as a group, so at least get to a 2-doctor first office, then make your second and third office be bigger than your first office. So your next, whether it's startup or acquisition, make sure that you've got the potential for this quality large practice. And I would so much rather have my second office be 3 doctors and kind of scale that up appropriately. And then my third office have the potential for 4 doctors and scale that up rather than buying 7 more practices that, between 3 and 4 doctors spread out over 7 offices versus spread out over 2, night and day difference.
Totally. And so now I think we're ready to finally talk about startups and acquisitions. And so there's kind of one more piece that we need to discuss, which will apply to both. This idea of adding value. So when you acquire a practice to do this well, right? You think about acquiring a practice once you start going to multiple, like you're paying someone a lot of money for their asset. And so they're going to be very discerning. They're going to want a good price. They're going to you're going to be paying a premium for these assets. And so if you're going to do that, if you're going to acquire, the best practices are to add value after the acquisition. So if your business plan is to find great practices, acquire them at high prices and make no improvements, then you're going to end up with a lot of debt and you're not going to actually build a lot of value for yourself. And that will result in not that much cash flow and ultimately not that much of a carrot for you if you end up selling. So on the startup side, it's the same thing. You're adding value with each additional location in a different way. In an acquisition, you're adding value by buying something in one state and improving the state of the operation to add value. Or in a startup, you're paying for the costs of opening up a new location, and then you're adding value by growing it to have profitability and maybe a large amount of collections, and then you're adding value. And so you need to think about it from the perspective of, and if I were you, if you're going down multiple, the worst thing that you can do is do a little bit of both, right? I acquire some, I start some, that's like you're doing neither very well because you're not focusing all on one or the other. And so when you think about, even if your goal is 2 to 3, you've got to be thinking about standardization of your business model. And so the standardization of your business model on the acquisition side is, how do I acquire practices in a predictable way and then add value every time after I buy them? Or on the startup side, you say, how do I find great locations and have a predictable way of growing those locations every time, right? So you need to start thinking about, what is my standardized model for growth? And I think that there's indications for both. But if you look at my feet kind of show you my path, I bought one office and I got my first location. And then once we went to multiple, we opened up 36 and we did 36 startups. So I tend to, we did this as a group because we understood that it is easier to add value. It's harder to do the startup route. It's a more grunt work, a lot more project management. You're starting everything from zero. However, there's more meat on the bone in terms of more value to add through that route than there is on the acquisition side. The acquisition side is very competitive. A lot of DSOs are trying to buy practices. You're going to have to pay a premium price. Every acquisition is a little different. And so you're going to have to deal with each office has its own unique history and culture and like all of these nuances. And so like most people, as they get bigger, they tend to lean more towards the startup side than the acquisition side. But that being said, 4 to 8, you can acquire all of those.
Yep.
And that's not a bad thing. You just need a standardized way of doing it.
Well, and with that, I will add, this actually goes back to informing our original discussion of like, if I've got a formula that works, there's a potential value add in starting into where it eventually can be. But it's easier to copy and paste that. And that's where the startup comes into play, as I can take a formula that works and build it again and build it again and build it again, versus an acquisition. You actually have a high risk that you lose value if the owner leaves, and it's no longer as productive. And to like really make a bunch of changes or to really grow a practice, we know this. There are times where to grow, you have to take on additional expenses. And when you're not the owner there driving the growth, it might take longer. It might cost more to grow that practice long term. And so there can be a period of unprofitability. If you're trying to add a bunch of value by growing an acquisition, which has a bunch of broken systems that maybe you didn't implement in the first place, there is risk that it's just hard. It's just hard to drive increased performance in an office that you're not running when it's got history. It's got this baggage of here's how we do things. Here's our demographics. Here's our patient base. So I think the value add is significantly higher on the acquisition side.
The value add is actually higher on the startup side.
Yes.
The value add on the acquisition side, I would think, is significantly harder. And so if you think about what somebody who's growing via acquisition is doing, they're standardizing the way they find practices, right? We have our process for finding opportunities. We have our standard way of evaluating opportunities. Then we have our standard way of integrating new practices, right? That's going to be integration, and implementation is going to be a part of your workflow and your standardized process. And then you need to have a standard way of growing profitability and adding value to existing practices, right? So like, it's not like if you grow via acquisition, you're not standardizing anything. You just have to find a way to standardize what you can standardize, knowing that there's going to be so much that you can't, or that will be very full of friction to standardize, right? You don't want to go in there and say like, we answer the phone this way with every office. This is how we do it, and it's like, if you do that for every little part of the practice, it's going to be very challenging for you to get buy-in and keep the team and preserve the goodwill that you're buying. Versus if you're doing a startup, you can essentially say, hi, new team member, welcome to the startup. When you work at this office, we answer the phone this way. And it's like, well, that's expected because you're training somebody who's never worked for this type of business before. And so it's just the challenges are very different. The startup is going to require, let's go through some of the cons maybe there. The startup is going to require way more engineering of process, right? The acquisition side, you can maybe get away with less process, but you're not going to have standardized processes. But the startups, if you don't give them clear enough instructions, they're just going to do whatever. And then you're going to end up, we saw this, it
way
can
worse.
get messy. Yeah. So, I just think that, the challenges are very different, but I tend to lean towards the startup as it is harder. It is more challenging. It has a longer timeline, but you can standardize more and you can more predictably add value. And so I think for those reasons, I tend to really subscribe to the idea that growth beyond multiple locations, I just see the startup as having more advantages than the acquisition.
I agree. Well, and I think there's kind of an old school mentality that a lot of people don't have patience for that I think applies really well in the acquisition front, which is it was like a family friend, my dad's friend growing up in Alberta, Canada. He talked about, he bought 3 gas stations and he told his son, like, one of the keys to wealth is actually take on as much debt as you can buying profitable assets and pay it down. So, it's like you buy $3 million worth of gas stations and you pay that down. All of a sudden in 10 years, you have a $3 million asset that's cash flowing. If you're to grow via acquisitions, I think this actually applies in the 2 to 3, in the 4 to 8 range. If you're to buy some healthy practices and gradually improve them, gradually add value and pay them off, in 10 years, you've got kind of this insane net worth of just the ownership of these offices and the value you've added. But I do think in dentistry, there is both an impatience for that.
Oh, yeah.
And then number two, the burden of ownership in this range of practices drives people to that impatience of like, oh crap, I don't like doing this. I don't like running 5 offices, 8 offices. This is burning me out. This is unsustainable. So I need to find an exit. And that rush to an exit is where people start gobbling up EBITDA without a lot of value add. And then it's this like, when can I get rid of this thing that I'm getting bigger and bigger and bigger? And that's what I see happening for people.
So I want to tell a story. So I got this call, and I'll be telling the story in my course. But I got this call from this guy that I've done business with. He's helped us with some bank loans and refinancing of debt. And he said, hey, I have this opportunity I'm taking a look at. There's this dentist with 10 offices, and he's gotten some bad debt. He's in some financial distress, and he needs help. He can't pay his debt, and it's coming due. And so I want to refinance his debt, and in exchange, I'm trying to get 70% ownership of his group. And so you think about this, this particular dentist, they over-levered. So they got too much debt. They didn't provide enough value. And then in this particular case, they added a lot of central costs. They opened like a central call center facility that was supposed to like make all the offices perform better, and that didn't really work. And then they had to take on some bad loans to kind of, pay off their expenses, and ultimately got themselves into financial trouble. So you think of the journey that this dentist has gone on. They've gone from 1 location to 10. And they've put in all those hours and all that hard work and all of that. And they are calling somebody asking. This isn't like the guy who's going to refinance is trying to convince him. No, it's the other way around. The dentist who's owning this practice is trying to convince the refinancing guy to take 70% of the equity in their business so that they can get a better debt terms and like get out of these high interest loans.
I'd file for bankruptcy at that point.
Yeah, right. But that's your options is, do I keep 30% of my equity in a 10 office group and, I have made some mistakes, or do I potentially file for bankruptcy and start over with nothing? Right. And so, I just say that to say that like this can get stressful and there's a lot of people that they've acquired these businesses, taken on these loans with no clear plan on how to add value. And then, imagine working for that many years. I would say maybe 10 offices took the guy maybe like 8 years, 9 years, potentially 10. And at the end of it, you will be giving away 70% of your equity that you've probably really held on to for a long time just to get out of financial stress.
Just to survive.
Yeah. And so I think that there's a steep learning curve to this. And there's some fundamentals that I'll go back to is quality over quantity, right? Like the reason why this person is having that type of conversation is because those 10 offices are quantity and they come with a large quantity of debt. And there's not a lot of quality to those offices. And this banker's calling me saying like, I kind of want to take this on because I think I could turn it around and make some good money. This banker is wanting to buy it by just refinancing the debt, taking 70% of the equity, running it like a better operation, growing these offices, making them profitable, and then selling it. And that's the business.
Was he looking to hire you to help him with this? That was my question.
Yeah, so it was an implant heavy group.
Okay.
So they did a lot of implants, and so the reason that I got the call was because this individual knows me to be very informed on implant dentistry and wanted me to provide some diligence guidance, like essentially take a look at the deal, take a look at their marketing, take a look at their revenue per patient, and provide guidance on how much meat was on the bone.
I'm really glad this example is here because I like the wet blanket. I like the warning sign of doing this wrong so that people are serious and intentional and do it right and do it for the right reasons with the right long-term plan, because otherwise you'll destroy yourself in this
Yeah.
process. The amount of risk, debt, time, stress, the load of the burden of ownership here multiplies. And can you build this sustainably? Here's my other adage with this. If you can't stomach the thought of holding on to this business and running it long term, you probably shouldn't build it in the first place.
Yeah.
Because that's going to ensure, if you're just trying to like put together a house of cards and sell it off, it's going to be much harder to sell, and you might end up in this situation. You might be trapped. And so being able to say to yourself honestly, like, you know what, I could own this and hold this, and I'm building it in a sustainable way to do that. Or being honest with yourself of like, yeah, I'm trying to build it up and exit as quick as possible. That's a gamble. That's a risk.
And I think, like, for me at least, when I think of like holding, I think of family, right? So it's like, if you have the thought of like, I want to build an asset for my family or something like that, or maybe say I want to build an asset for myself and I want to run this into retirement. Like, I want to retire as a dentist and run this. Like, I know a dentist who has 5 offices and gave me a call and was like, I'm getting close to the end of my clinical career. He's just added one after the other, very slowly and methodic. I think the reason I told that story at the beginning, the wet blanket story, or not the beginning, like somewhat recently, is the impatience will not be your friend.
Right.
And then I have this opposite situation of this dentist that I know, who I told him, like, I admire the way that you've gone about this. It's like 20-year career, adding a location once every few years, owns the real estate of all of them, very little debt on all of the locations. And it's just this cash flowing thing. And he just keeps opening up whenever he has enough money, opens up another one, buys the building, owns the real estate, very patient, very methodical, quality locations across the board, all make money. And I was talking to him like, what's your end game? And he's like, well, in a couple years, I want to stop practicing clinically. But I want to keep owning and operating this business. And it's kind of like my game of checkers that I like. And it's just really fun. And like, that's the mindset that does really well in this, because you're patient, you're deliberate. There is no short-term end in sight. And there's a passion for the entrepreneurship. Like, that's when done well. Quality locations, not overburdening yourself with debt, because debt comes with stress. Yeah. Like, those two come together. And I think that kind of rich dad, poor dad concept of like, oh, just take on all these loans, have them be profitable loans, get yourself up to your eyeballs in debt, and then like, have that pay off for you in 10 years when you pay off all that debt. That can work. But that can only work when executed at a high level. And when not executed at a high level, that can lead to a lot of stress, similar to the story that I told earlier. So I just think that, through this experience, I've learned, and that quality versus quantity is just such a core fundamental. And I think that patience that you also talked about is also very important. I think so. I think this whole topic was supposed to be acquisition versus startup, and I think that we veered pretty far off of that road. But I also think it was great.
This is the multi-practice, but it matters because understanding the long game informs the startup versus acquisition.
Yeah.
And I'll give one final example here of I got to hear Tito of Tito's Vodka lecture.
Oh yeah.
And he is the sole owner of Tito's Vodka. And it is like, I don't know, multi-billion-dollar company. He started it, and for like 7-8 years, just like, he knew the business model worked. He was super patient with it. He knew that once he was able to scale, the math would all work. But it was very much a grind. But once he got it up, and once he got it running, and once he built the whole team, and it scaled, then people are like, well, why don't you sell this? Why don't you sell it to private equity? And he's like, why would I do that? I want control of this business. I want to be able to do what I want with it. And I want to be able to, he's super passionate about all of these projects he's funding that are charitable projects, they're research projects that are like, like off the wall stuff that no one is funding. And he's like, I can do that. Like, I want to fund that project. It's like, what are we actually going to do if an asteroid hits the Earth? Like, what is the actual plan? Who is working on that? And like, let's like push further in that direction, because he's a geologist. He did oil, and he lets a lot of his team direct where they want charity or passion or research to go. And as the owner, with all this profit and all of this control, he can do whatever the heck he wants. And I think dentistry is a vehicle to own and do good in the world, to have control, to benefit and bless the lives of your team, your patients, and then whoever the heck else you want to help with your office. So that's where I think as well, not only the patient side of things, but the purpose side of things in
Yeah.
owning long-term comes into play.
Well, and I think that as healthcare goes towards a more consolidated industry, which is happening across all of healthcare, dentistry included, there's a need out there in the world for dentist-owned and operated businesses that, keep the fiduciary responsibility that we have to do no harm and treat people well and provide great dentistry. Like, that's needed. And so, like that purpose right there and like providing great dental services to your community, like that is a very noble and like that's a great mission to get behind. And so like I think that like there's so much good that can be done through owning an organization and holding it, and I totally agree.
Well, this has been, man, George, these last 2 episodes I think have been 2 of my favorite episodes in all of Shared Practices history. It's just like it all keeps coming together, and as now you've had conversations with large multi-practice owners, you've seen things behind the scenes, we've done a whole lot, and we can bring these lessons back down to the single office or the second office or the fourth office, or do you really want to do the 15th office? Is that actually where you're going? Let's have a real discussion first before you accidentally hate your life in a few years. So all of this is just amazing wisdom that we get to pass on to our listeners. It's really a really cool conversation to have.
Yeah, and I think, the thing that I'm really happy we just restarted the whole show.
Yeah.
wipe the slate clean. Because, if you go back in time, I was a third-year dental student when we were talking about these topics. I was third and fourth-year dental student, right? You think about how much I've learned in the experience of going from a third-year dental student who was bugging Richard about, like very nerdy practice management topics and like very, very into practice management to somebody who has made mistakes, been humbled, learned, and come. And I think that what you said before is like an agnostic perspective, right? I really try to approach things from that way of like, these are all tools in the tool belt, and for each situation, some may make more sense than the other. And so I really feel like it's our job now to do the initial purpose of the show, which is to pass on practice management, knowledge in just an agnostic way. It's like, this is what you should do in these situations. And I think for the last 2 Ask George episodes, I do think we've done that. And that is really cool because, there was a lot of times on the show where we said things that we probably wouldn't say today. And I think I'm pretty confident that a lot of the things I said today, I will say again in 5 years.
I love it. George, this has been incredible. We're just basking in this moment. So sorry, listeners, you're just like here as George and I are hanging out.
Yeah, maybe we'll turn it off and then we'll just keep talking.
Exactly. So thank you for, as always, just crushing it on Ask George. I love this segment, and I'm grateful to be podcasting with you.
Awesome. Thanks, Richard.
We'll talk to you next time on the Shared Practices podcast.